Hello again, friends, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video. In this particular video, I would really like to give testimony to how I believe God uses the scripture to open our eyes, to open our hearts, and to change our minds about how we understand who He is and what He is going to be doing. In Joel chapter 2, He says, beginning in verse 28, I will pour out my spirit on all humanity. Then your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your old men will have dreams, and your young men will see visions. I will even pour out my spirit on the male and female slaves in those days. I will display wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. See, as I was reading that, I saw that God actually gave signs in the heavens of what must take place before the day of the Lord. And I thought, as a pre-tribulational believer, I was always told there were no signs. There was nothing else that had to happen. The next thing on God's schedule was the rapture. But here it is, as plain as day. There are going to be signs before the day of the Lord. And I thought, okay, well, I think I might be able to work that out. Maybe the rapture happens first, and then sometime later, maybe days, maybe weeks, I don't know, there would be this day of the Lord. And so you could still have the rapture without any signs. And I thought maybe that's how it would work. But then I considered what Jesus said again in Matthew 24. And I know I keep coming back to this because this understanding really helped me to see what Jesus was talking about. So let me revisit that. Matthew 24, beginning in verse 29. He says, immediately after the distress or the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. See, again, as a pre-tribulational believer, I always associated this tribulation with the day of the Lord. But Jesus doesn't do that. And Joel gives specific signs as to what must happen before the day of the Lord. The idea of before there is not in front of, as though you're in the presence of something. It's actually the chronological before. In other words, this must happen, and only after this happens will the next thing happen. And so the day of the Lord could not come until then. But then I thought, well, but as a pre-tribulational believer, I know that Matthew 24 was not written for the church. It was written for Israel, or so I had always been told. The problem with that is that Jesus is talking to his believing disciples. He's not talking to unbelievers. The only way Matthew 24 could be intended for Israel is if his disciples, his believing disciples, were actually representing unbelieving Israel, because that's who the pre-tribulational teachers say is alive at this time during Matthew 24, because they say the church is already gone. That's very odd to me. I thought, why would the disciples, believing disciples, represent unbelieving Israel merely because they were Jews? And I thought, okay, maybe. But then I'm starting to see in the book of Acts and the other epistles that they were preaching and teaching exactly in accordance with what Jesus had said. Take, for example, on the day of Pentecost. Now, this is the event where a lot of people believe the church began. Some people believe the church began a little before Pentecost. A few days, a few months, even a few years. But we'll just use the day of Pentecost because it's generally accepted that it at least happened by that date, okay? So if you believe it happened before Pentecost, that's fine. It doesn't really change what I'm going to say here. When Peter is preaching and the Spirit of God comes upon him and he is preaching and he is speaking in a way where people from all over the world can hear him, they accuse him of being drunk, even though it's early in the day. And he says, "No, I am not drunk. This is what the prophet Joel said would happen." And he quotes that very passage out of Joel chapter 2, where he says, "I will pour out my Spirit on all people." And he goes on to say that these events must happen before the day of the Lord. Note at verse 20, Acts 2, verse 20. It says, "The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and glorious day of the Lord comes. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." You remember that verse because Paul says that in Romans chapter 10. These are New Testament preachers preaching to the church using the same teaching structure Jesus used in Matthew 24, and they are relating events that will happen during this time to the day of the Lord. So again, the preaching here of the New Testament writers, Jesus' apostles, who had been given authority by him to lead the church, did not disregard Jesus' teaching in Matthew 24 as being for some other group of people. In fact, they preached to the church, expecting the church to respond to this information because they believed it was consistent with what Jesus was saying before. And friends, we should expect that. And so when I started to see how the day of the Lord theme is perpetuated, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, I began to see, when does the rapture actually occur? Sometime after these heavenly signs. There will be a coming day of great tribulation, friends. Do not be asleep. Do not deny that it is coming. You need to steel your hearts with faith in Jesus Christ, who has already overcome the world. And that day of tribulation is coming. But there is another day after that that is coming, and it was when God is going to execute his wrath upon an unbelieving and ungodly and unrepentant world. But before God pours out his wrath, he is going to rapture us out. And so sometime after these heavenly signs take place, sometime soon, Jesus said, when you see these things in heaven take place, look up, for your redemption is near. It is at that time that the rapture can be, at any moment, and not before then. Those who teach that the rapture could take place at any moment, right now, are just misinformed. And unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of people who are listening to that, and they are not going to be ready. And when the Great Tribulation actually comes, they will be caught off guard. And unfortunately, many will suffer because they do not give this teaching the seriousness it deserves. And so God used this theme of the day of the Lord to show me how he is going to unfold his plan in this world. And we will spend more time on this in future videos. But until then, thank you again.